I know before the next election you'll have a housing policy, but can you give us some indication that this is a top priority? Because it seems, that's a great policy and everything, but something drastic needs to be done here, doesn't it? Because we talk about supply. Yes, supply is the number one issue. But in the short term, like, young people just can't afford to buy a home. If you're on a good wage, it's just not going to happen for you in your lifetime.
That's right. Supply is the number one issue. It's the only way to sustainably bring house prices down and to make sure that home ownership is accessible to all people. The government so far has only been talking about social housing. That's not home ownership. Social housing is a very different beast. And the policy that they got through, the Housing Australia a future fund, is in fact borrowed money, $10 billion of borrowed money on behalf of the taxpayer that gets invested in the future fund, and it's only the returns on that future fund investment that get invested into social housing. Moreover, that you have to pay interest on that and a management fee. It probably costs around $500 million a year just to maintain that fund before it ever makes a return that gets invested in social housing, which was the reason why the coalition wouldn't pass that legislation, opposed that legislation in the Parliament. We've also seen an additional $3 billion magically appear for social housing since the May budget. Already, this Labor government was spending around $185 billion more announced in that May budget than the coalition would have as at the last election. Add another $3 billion to that wasn't even included in the budget. You can see why that spending, that urge to spend, is driving aggregate demand and keeping inflation too high. And that's really the topic of the day today, isn't it? Because the RBA has made that
you say it's
yesterday.
spending, but that's not what the RBA said. I mean, in the last data drop we had, which for the month of August, said essentially it was mostly down to fuel. Shane Oliver says, well, that might actually act like a tax on spending anyway.
It certainly does. And what you're talking about there is headline inflation, and that has been driven up by the cost of fuel. The real problem, though, is core inflation, which takes out those seasonal effects and takes out fuel. That's still way too high. It's around, I think it's 5.5% now. Yeah. And that's well above the Reserve Bank's band of 2 to 3%. That's driven by aggregate demand. Aggregate demand has two parts. It has public sector spending and private sector spending. We know that private sector spending has come right back. In fact, the economy is shuddering to a halt. But public sector spending is still way too high, and that's driving up aggregate demand. That's what
but I mean, there's competing interests
here. The government has to do
some
of the heavy lifting.
Yeah, sure, but they've just posted the first surplus. That's what we mean when we say that the government has to do some of the heavy lifting. Yeah, sure, but first surplus in 15 years, essentially. And there's cost of living crisis,
this discussion before, Laura.
And you want them to spend. Yeah. You do want them to spend on the people that most need it, right?
Well, we want to make sure that essential services are delivered. There's absolutely no doubt about that. But it's this natural urge that governments have to spend, and particularly a Labor government that's been in exile for 9 years. It's got this magic wish list of things that it wants to spend money on. It has to rein in that urge, because that's what drives the public sector component of aggregate demand. We've seen things like 10,000 new additional public servants. Of course, that puts pressure on the public purse. That adds to aggregate demand. So if the government can rein in its spending ambitions while the private sector is doing the same, that's the only thing that's going to bring down inflation to that 2 to 3% band. What the RBA said yesterday is that it now sees that inflation is going to last higher for longer. In fact, it's going to last until around the end of 2025. Now, for anybody that's got a mortgage that knows how bad it feels to have interest rates this high right now, the thought of an additional 2 years of pain, I think that it should be really people would find that very overwhelming. That's why we're trying to urge the government to have an economic plan specifically to bring down inflation, because it's the only way you can tackle the cost of living.
Jane Hume, good to see you. Thanks so much.
Great to be with you, Laura.